I'm going to talk about settlement imprint, which is I guess, an academic way of describing the influence of our immigrant ancestors, the cultural significance of what they brought with them to initially the American colonies, of course, but then in subsequent years, really up to the present. But I'm mostly concerned about what their cultural imprint was in terms of their agricultural knowledge and particularly agricultural building knowledge. Because what happened here in what becomes the United States was that these various immigrant groups, mostly from Western Europe and Northern Europe, and to some extent Southern and Eastern Europe, was that these were primarily farmers. They came here because there was land available. I know that the traditional story is that people were escaping oppression in this place and that place, and certainly that's true, and I don't want to discount that story. But what was really happening for so many people who came here, particularly in the earliest settlement days, was there was an opportunity here of land, to have land that you could actually own and not just work on for somebody else. And that was a major transition in the way people lived. From going from serfdom to ownership, essentially. So they brought with them the things that they knew about agriculture, and one of those things, for my topic at least, is how they raised their animals, stored their grain, and so on. So they brought their barn knowledge and their outbuilding knowledge as well as their housing knowledge. There's a huge academic field largely called folklore, which deals with vernacular architecture, housing in particular, but also barns and so on. But there hasn't been a ton of research about the styles that are brought in initially, and I will start with the English barn because it's kind of the classic example. But what happens after they get here? Because if you think of 1620, or 1700 as initiating the settlement period for most of the earliest immigrants, and you only talk about that, you're leaving out 250 years of barn history that happens after they get here. And that's the famous melting pot story that we all probably heard in the 4th grade or something. Because Germans moved in next to Swiss, moved in next to Englishmen, moved in next to Africans, moved in next to Swedes, and suddenly started sharing their cultural knowledge. And one of the things that was affected most was not only the way that they farmed and the techniques that through which they farmed, but the buildings that they built. And so the initial English barn, we have a model of a pretty simple example of one back there, very rapidly changes form over time. Now the pictures that you see behind me are all English barn variants, okay? So the one on the far left upper corner is a very simple early example of a barn that was probably built around 1800 and is very, very close to the barn that you would have found in Scotland, Ireland, or England in 1600. Very little difference in terms of size, footprint, scale, the way it was used, and so on. But as those pictures go across, you'll see changes, first in breadth and height and pitch of the roof. They moved to gambrel roofs. They moved the door from the middle to the left, and so on. So these are all minor variations that don't really meaningfully change the way the barn is used, but they're adaptations to make the barn use and construction better for whoever happens to be using it. Cultural imprint is a really complex issue to talk about, and it's I guess the easiest thing to say is that it's imprecise. So on your left, you see a map called the Movement of Ideas, and this is an attempt of folklore specialists to track cultural ideas as they moved west. So from the settlement period in New England, the mid-Atlantic states and the South, and these myriad lines cross each other, change direction, and so on. If you look closely into southern Indiana and southern Ohio, you'll see two routes coming up from the deep south or the Midland South. Most of southern Indiana's barns got there by people who came that route, okay? So the barns in southern Indiana originate from a different cultural group than the barns in northern Indiana, or people who came across New England, northern Ohio, upper Ohio, and into upper Indiana. And if you just to make it simple, in southern Indiana, you'll see very, very early examples of English barns because that immigrant group brought that particular barn up through the south. And in the north, you'll see Pennsylvania Dutch barns, which actually come from southeastern Pennsylvania via Switzerland. But that immigrant group came into northern Indiana. If you travel the state, you'll see changes in the architecture of barns dependent upon where these settlement areas were. Now, to make it impossible to understand, it's a very mixed bag. As you can see from these arrows, they're really going every which way. And so there is no, I can't stand here and say all the Pennsylvania Dutch barns in Indiana are north of Indianapolis. It's just not true. There are some in Du Bois County. But generally speaking, we can look at those maps. And the map on your right, material folk culture regions, is just describing cultural centers. So mine's kind of small, but the Mid-Atlantic, the New England, the Upper South, and so on, these are meant to encapsulate regions where this cultural milieu is settling. And so there is some ability for us to say, for instance, from eastern Tennessee, a certain type of barn originates because that cultural group invented that particular, actually American style of barn. That is a conglomerate of all the immigrant influences, but is actually a new form, okay? And I'll get there. So the earliest barns that we see, and I'm going to primarily talk about Indiana, because you have to remember, we don't really get settled by white men until 1800. You know, that's a pretty easy general date to use. Coming across through the Ohio, down the Ohio River and up into southern Indiana, we don't see structures really before that date, and there probably were some, but they're not with us anymore. But the earliest barn structures tend to be cribs that are log. The word crib just means room. If you're talking about barns or agricultural buildings, if you're talking about houses, the word is pen. So you have double pen and triple pen houses, and you have crib and double crib and triple crib barns. So this is a simple crib barn, has a small framed loft above it. I happen to know that this barn, the logs of this barn date to the very early 1800s, but it was originally a cabin and somebody moved it downstream on their farm, reconstructed it as a small animal barn. So it's actually a second or third generation form using the same materials. But it's a good example of a very simple, small subsistence farm crib. If you notice, there are vertical slats on the logs, wood slats. When you see these, it means that the building originally was sided with horizontal wood siding, and those are furring strips. They're just nailing strips. Nashville, Indiana is famous for having stripped all the siding off their log cabins and making log cabins a big deal, but they're really meant to be protected by siding. So if you own one, put the siding back on. So that's a really good example of an early one. And we, of course, do barn inspections all over the state, and Kathy and I have traveled a lot in southern Indiana in particular, looking at barns over the last several years. And one of the things that I've noticed in the oldest settlement areas is that you can still find farmsteads that are almost completely intact. So there's been virtually no change in them since they were first constructed. Now, obviously, if you settle a farm, you may build the barn first and then the house and then the chicken house and so on. But the general idea was that you had separate buildings for separate uses. different animals, different grain storage, obviously living. And so this picture is a really good example in southern Indiana of a complete farmstead that is, as far as we can tell, almost completely intact and has really good examples of early forms in the state. In the background is an English barn that is as pure a form of English barn as you're likely to find anywhere in America. And we have them here in southern Indiana, and I've seen probably 24 of them that are still being used largely, still in excellent condition. They're very small. They have a central or slightly to the left door on both sides. Those are the threshing doors. These were originally built as threshing barns. The principle of it is that you could open the doors, bring in your wheat, dump it on a hard floor or packed earth, knock out all the grain, and then open the opposite door, and all of the part that you don't want blows out with the wind. And they put wooden thresholds on either door so that none of the grain would blow out when the wind came in. Threshold, right? That's where that word comes from. The barn in front is a later frame barn built around a crib. And this is quite common in southern Indiana also. So sometimes you'll go and you'll look at a barn and somebody will say, well, how old do you think that barn is? You say, well, it looks like maybe 1870. When I get inside, I'll be able to tell. And you walk inside and there's a crib that dates to 1790. Often they're initialed or etched or have family names on them, all kinds of scarring, and also all kinds of detail that tell you things about just the skill and craft level of the people who built them. Here you see hand-hewn logs up close, and my favorite, I don't know if you can, I think I'll use my pointer here, maybe you can see it right here. No, you can't. Is a wooden pin hinge. So on the left of that door, there's a little peg sticking up, and that's a pin hinge. It's all made out of wood. There is no metal in that door, other than some nails up above where they had to cover up a hole. This is a double crib barn in Monroe County, and I'm going to talk to you about the evolution of the crib barn and how that becomes yet another style of barn. But the double crib barn is basically one crib built here, another crib built here, probably for different uses. One might have been to keep the milk cow in, the other was to store grain, perhaps. They were never chinked like cabins. They were usually just had a single roof. And as the farm grew, cribs were added. And so you get this accretion, and the barn style changes as you add cribs, because pretty soon you've got two. If you've got two alongside each other, you take the roof off of each of one and put one roof over the whole thing, and now you've got a center aisle that you can protect your wagon and your other goods in. And if you build four, you've got a cross aisle between them, and you can either fill it in and create yet another crib, or you can drive through the barn in either direction. And these are all variations that happen over probably a period of less than 75 years. Folklorists have tracked these crib forms into eastern Tennessee. Okay, that's the first and earliest ones that we found. It isn't that no one in the upland south of South Carolina ever built a log crib, they did. But these evolutionary ones that seem to change form are more common in eastern Tennessee, and we think that's as much as possible the origin of what later becomes the Midwestern barn. This one's very intact and well taken care of, and is actually quite large. These cribs are about 17 feet square, something like that. And here's another one in southern Indiana, a lovely timber frame barn built around an original crib barn, and this farm also has a very original English barn on it up the hill from what they call Dad's barn, which was the new one. And they didn't know who built the original English barn on the property. It wasn't a family member. But Dad built this larger barn around an existing crib that was down the hill from the English barn. So in this case, it's impossible for me to know which of these was built earlier, depending on, or whether the crib was built before the English barn style or not. It wouldn't necessarily have been, because these things are, first of all, they're imprinting English barns and bringing them west with them, or the knowledge to build them, and they're also building cribs once they get to the site. So they're not necessarily, it's not easy to date them, but we know that the new barn, Dad's barn, was obviously built around the original crib. So here's that English 3-bay threshing barn again. I showed you a picture of a minute ago. The central bay is the driveway, the threshing bay, and there's a bay on either side. Traditionally, they may have kept some animals in these barns, but these are subsistence farms, so they may have had a milk cow, a mule or workhorse, and they might have been stabled to the left of the door, and to the right of the door, which was often a slightly bigger bay, would be built-in airtight grain bins or rat-tight grain bins. And there were no lofts in these barns to speak of. There was no hay storage at this moment. All hay was shocked and just stored in the field. And animals weren't sheltered, generally speaking. And there isn't any commercial animal husbandry at this time to speak of. You may raise workhorses and sell them to your neighbors, but you're not in the commercial business of raising large amounts of crops or raising a lot of animals. So the buildings are small and simple and utilitarian, and each building has its own use. Unlike what happens later when the big barns are built and they're intended to encompass the entire operation. So here's an English barn about this is probably post-Civil War. And what these barge boards, the scalloped barge boards that you see, that's a particularly Scandinavian decorative motif. So it's very likely that somebody from the Scandinavian countries or the offspring of that family, that settlement family, influenced the construction of this barn. It still has the central threshing door. The side walls are slightly taller. It's unlikely that there's a loft in here. And then they've added another door, lower door to the left. This barn is slightly banked in, so the middle of it is higher than the end. And then there's a machine shed built on one end of it. And this, of course, happens as people get wealthier. They have more and more wagons. We call them machines because we think it was just for tractors. But these sheds were mostly for wagons. And the center aisle was also used for wagon storage. And the barn in general has more square feet, but it's still a 3-bay configuration. This is a barn actually that Kent showed me first. There's a variation on the English barn in southern Indiana that is unique to Indiana, and I've never actually seen it in any other state, which I call the double English barn. It's longer, it's lower, and it has 2 threshing aisles. One of them was probably used for threshing and the other one was probably used for something else. We don't really know. These came to my attention because we were talking about tobacco barns, and Kent said, oh, all the tobacco barns in southern Indiana are adapted English barns. And I was like, what? And he's right, a lot of them are. Very few people had the money to build an official tobacco barn, which is its own style. I'll show you in a little bit. But this barn, that's really in very southern Indiana, like in the river basin is the only place I've seen these. With one exception, and that's this one, which is being adapted in Allen County near Fort Wayne. It's being adapted for tourist use, basically. And this is also what I would call a double English barn. And it just has 2 threshing aisles. When you go in this barn, the threshing aisles are separated by a wall. So it's like they sat down one small English barn and then built another one next to it. And they're joined inside, but there's a separate wall. So they may have been built at separate times and put together. We don't really know. Just an adaptation that's unique to mostly southern Indiana, except for this one example that we found in. I went to speak at this tourist site. They have buffalo and antelope, and I can't remember the name of the place right now, but I did a lecture there, and they had already adapted this barn, and we were working in it that evening. But they showed me these pictures of how they cribbed it up so they could move it. And as you've already heard about the Biddle barn, this happens all the time, although this one wasn't dismantled. So this is a late 19th century English barn. The door has been moved slightly to the left. This is a 4-bay barn. Now we have a hay loft. We have hay doors. We have a hay track. We have a hay hood over the end of the hay doors and a commercial ventilator. These are all things that are adapted for they are ways of adapting barns for commercial farming and enterprise. There's also a milk house on the right end corner, which only starts to occur when milk harvesting is regulated, so that we know that milk is safe to drink. You had to have separate milk houses, and they were whitewashed and usually built out of masonry and so on. It also has lightning rods. These are all things that are developed during the so-called scientific agricultural revolution, starting in around 1879 up into 1910 or 20, when universities, the land-grant universities, Purdue, of course, in Indiana, but University of Wisconsin, University of Illinois, and so on, are all developing agriculture departments. They start out, I think Purdue started as a botany department. They start out and they become more and more developing agricultural education, obviously, but also assisting farmers in the field and so on. And these so-called scientific discoveries or revolutions are responses to real problems. The lightning rod is a response to fire that happens, and barns caught fire all the time. I mean, all you had to do was kick over Mrs. O'Leary's lantern and you were there. And so lightning rods were an important way to draw the electricity in a lightning storm off into the ground. Ventilators became popular when manure storage, it became clear that manure was not good for you to breathe. So, and then ventilators first of all, they're done with louvered windows and so on, and then they become commercially available and you can buy ventilators and put them on your barn. And the configuration of this kind of English adaptation changes slightly. In other words, more doors are added, the barns are used in different ways for more purposes as we approach modernity. But the basic English barn is still there. So whoever built this barn, somehow in their heritage, that was the model they had in their head when somebody said barn. And that's what they built. And they just adapted it slightly. Particularly the addition of a hayloft, but notice that there is no gambrel roof here. They haven't yet invented a roof that would hold more hay. They've just raised the barn wall and put a floor above it. I say just, I mean, it's a very important fact. Here's one about the same age. We don't see the gambrel roof until the 1870s on barns. They are on some Dutch colonial houses, but primarily you don't see, and there are different styles of gambrel roofs. There's English gambrel and Dutch gambrel, and I don't go into that stuff. But it's obviously a way of creating more space for hay storage. Now we're talking primarily loose hay storage, not baled hay. But notice that the door is still slightly off center. It's got a little pent roof over it and a little peak. That's probably for ventilation, and windows on the stalls, this is also a response to the knowledge that you need to ventilate any building that's got a lot of manure in it, so there are probably animals being kept in this building, lightning rod, and so on. But now we have a gambrel roof, and so we're working toward a bigger and bigger commercial adaptation of the barn. The problem with the gambrel roof in the early timber barns is and you might be able to imagine it when you look at our models, is that the timber frame goes all the way up into the loft and creates a lot of obstruction. So if you're moving around up there and you're trying to operate a hay trolley and you're bringing in loose hay, you're stepping over tie beams and bumping your head on braces, and it's a nuisance and it takes up a lot of storage space. A slightly later adaptation of the same English format, again with a gambrel roof, a hay hood, a hay storage, a hay access door, and so on. But now we have masonry basement foundations. And so usually concrete, in the earliest ones. And then, of course, by 1900, 1910, we have manufactured concrete block. And so you start to see concrete block. And then you see custom concrete block, which is concrete block made to look like stone. And you'll, depending on the part of Indiana you're in, you'll see those responses based in the manufacturing of those kinds of products. So I think it's Warsaw, they have a famous block operation there that makes split-face limestone, or block that looks like split-face limestone. And so all the barns there have these basement foundations that use that particular product. But that's also a response to what manure does to timber frame buildings. It rots the posts. And so if you can have a concrete basement, you can get away with the concrete outer, or the wood frame outer wall up at least 3 feet off the ground, and now your barn will last longer. The other primary style in Indiana that you see is the transverse frame barn. All that means is that the main entry door, the swing doors or the sliding doors are not on the side like the threshing barn, but they're on the end and on the gable end, like in this example. And what that does, I'll show you how that evolves in a second. But what that does is it allows you to drive from one end of the barn all the way through the other end of the barn, and your stalls and storage areas and work areas are on your right or left. And if you add to your barn, you can continually add to the end, and the aisle gets longer and longer, but you never have to change your main orientation. In the English barn, where the door is in the middle of the long side, if you start adding onto the barn, you're getting farther and farther away from the wagon door, which is more work, basically. So you still have to have some kind of aisleway or passageway to get there. The transverse barn solves that problem and becomes very popular very quickly. And this is the barn that, as I said, has its origin in eastern Tennessee. It's a little bit complicated. I think you can see it pretty well. But this is a conjectural, I have to say, idea of a folklorist at Indiana University named Henry Glassy. He's a very, very well-known international folklorist, works all over the world. He's still alive. He's a good friend of ours. And he's done, initially in his work, he did a lot of work in vernacular architecture in barns, and then he sort of moved on to other kinds of cultural artifacts, and now he's working in South America with religious figurines and things like that. So he's a very widespread interest. But he postulated this scheme based on his research in eastern Tennessee, which was that the initial, that doesn't work. The initial single crib, which I've shown you many pictures of, evolves into several forms. So the dark parts are the driveways, and sometimes they're covered and sometimes they're not. And the white parts are the enclosure, so the barn itself. So there's a variation with a front drive crib, side drive crib, and then a single crib with sheds on either side. So these are all forms that are adapted later into all different kinds of barns. But in particular, it becomes particularly important for the transverse barn, which is, if you follow the areas, here's the double crib barn I showed you with the driveway in the middle. Here's another type of it, which is smaller cribs, but slightly wider barn. Another double crib, but they're all basically the same principle. You drive through from the side, and you have a barn room on either side. And here's the 4 crib barn that I talked about, where you've built 4 on the corners, and then you have a cross aisle in between. And what happens is whoever builds this suddenly has an aha moment, and he goes, wow, if I put 2 more cribs in there, I'd have a 6 crib barn, and I'd have 1 aisle that went all the way through. And suddenly you have the transverse crib barn. Once they stop making them out of logs, they're called transverse frame barns, because they're framed and not log built. So that's the essential evolution. And the offshoots are the Appalachian barn, which has its cross aisle on the end, and there's a slightly different style of it. And then if you move down, I think you can still see it, this becomes this, where you have an aisle on either outer side, these are usually under sheds, and that's called a Midwest three-portal barn, and there's a slightly different variation of it. So that becomes the most popular barn in America, okay? And they're all over the place. I'll show you some pictures here of them. And I know you will have seen plenty of them. And Henry postulated that that is the sort of genealogy of the evolution of that barn style. Lots of people have quoted it, a few people have questioned it, but nobody has seriously argued with it, including me, least of all. So I suspect that he's onto something. So here's a slightly different transverse barn. Again, I'm really just trying to show you the ways that they adapt ventilation, ventilators, roof style, size of barn, height of wall, and so on. So barns get bigger and bigger and bigger, and they get more and more complicated, and they take on more and more tasks from the early original farmsteads, which had multiple buildings and single task buildings. And I'm just going to show you a few examples. This is a Victorian era one with a cross-gabled cupola, which is absolutely beautiful. And this one is transverse. The main door, the main wagon doors are here. It has a little Victorian spool work like you would see on a porch. These are called pent roofs, by the way. And they are actually evolved from the Pennsylvania Dutch barn. So somebody has talked to somebody from southeastern Pennsylvania or Switzerland when they built this barn. And these are Victorian attributes. Ventilation windows up high in the loft area, and then also a side aisle door. Okay, so they realized that, yes, you want to be able to drive in through the end, and you want extra doors on either aisle, but you also are going to need to be able to enter into the middle of the barn. So this is, you could say this is an English barn adaptation, or you could say it's a transverse barn adaptation. But as you see, they get more and more complex. The side aisle, it becomes a major feature, particularly in hay barns where the majority of the square footage is dedicated to hay storage. But these side aisles, in this case, was probably not added on because it's so well integrated into the pitch of the roof. So even though there's a slight architectural break there, this was probably planned and built all at one time. So here's a machine shed built onto the side. And this, by 1880, it becomes common to see barns of this size. This is basically a hay barn. It's transverse. You drive through a center aisle. There are probably stalls on either side. There's an open machine shed, which usually is an indication that you're backing a tractor in there with a plow or disc or bush hog or whatever, so you can offload it but still have easy access to it. Hay door, hay hood, lightning rods, and so on, all modern conveniences. And now we've got barns that are actually attempting, are a response to commercial farming. So you're no longer just milking one cow and feeding one mule, and you're actually farming commercially for money, as they say. And here's a three-portal barn. It's a little bit difficult to see the side aisle doors. This is an older one, this is called a bent roof, where you have a gable that's bent out on either side. And here's a classic Midwestern three-portal barn. Has anybody in here not seen one of these? Anybody own one? No? No, I'm surprised. But if you drive west of Ohio and keep going, it's almost the only barn you see after you get past the Mississippi River. And in what we think of this as Midwest, which stops at Illinois, but in Nebraska and Iowa and on out into Oklahoma, these are quite common. And there is another barn that's kind of called a prairie barn, but it's not quite this style. But I don't want to say barn evolution stops at this moment, because obviously that's not clear. We moved to the pole barn rather quickly after World War II, so that's where it stopped. But so changes continue to happen. But this barn satisfies the hay loft, and some of these, well, none of them have gambrel roofs on them, but they satisfy the hayloft problem issue. They give you a central aisle. They create large side aisles, which could either be stalls, feeding areas, run-in areas, machine sheds. You could put in a shop. You know, they became very, very versatile and very popular. And do not occur in Europe, do not come in as a settlement pattern. They're an American form. We don't have any Dutch barns in Indiana that I've ever seen. This is about as close to it. But the Dutch barn is a gable roof, rectangular, almost square barn. It comes clearly from the Netherlands. They're common, were common in New England, and you can still find them. They have a low sidewall, a vast loft space, very low sidewall. These are obviously added on, but they have a very unique timber frame configuration inside, which is the way you really identify them. I don't have a picture of the inside of one, but you won't see very many of these at all in Indiana, if any pure forms. This one and this one are the only ones I've ever seen, and they're probably, you know, I haven't seen them all, but this is actually a new barn, which is a stable, but it's built in that configuration with the long roof and the low sidewall and a vast interior space. So the German 4-bay barn was the Pennsylvania Dutch barn, not Dutch as in Netherlands, but Deutsch as in German. Okay, so that's, during the settlement period, somehow Deutsch became Dutch. It was too hard to say Deutsch. So that's my explanation. I don't know why, but their origin is Germanic, I should say, because it's really the Holy Roman Empire at that moment in time. But their specific regional origin is what is now Switzerland. Well, Switzerland didn't exist when the first immigrants came out of the Germanic states to the United States. But the only predecessors to this style of barn that we found in Europe are all in Switzerland. And they were built almost always as bank barns into the side of very steep inclines. And as you probably know, Switzerland is 99% mountainous in their steep mountains. But they think that it was partly adapted from the so-called Alpine house, which has this 4-bay overhang on it that was intended to protect the people who live there and the workers around the house from weather, primarily from snow and ice load. And so when they built their barns, they did the same thing. They cantilevered the 4-bay out over a sheltered place. The basement of the barn is used for animals, and the upper part of the barn, which is usually banked in or ramped, is a huge upper story. There's multiple use: grain storage, hay storage, machinery storage, wagon storage, and occasionally they stabled workhorses. Also a pent roof on one end, and lots of ventilation, which was true in even the oldest forms. Here's one in northern Indiana that is what's called an unsupported 4-bay. So it's cantilevered off the floor. There's no posts. There's nothing holding that up. This is abandoned, but still has all the features: louvered ventilators, gable roof, and interestingly, they almost always put doors on the opposite side, so-called threshing doors, right? On the opposite side, even though you couldn't drive into them or access them. But you could, if you threshed on that floor, you could still blow the chaff out by opening the door. And so that's a holdover, if you will, from the threshing barn. Here's another example, pent roof. This one's got a machine addition on the end. And this one is partially supported by this block wall, which probably isn't original. And you can see they vary quite a bit in terms of their squareness, how rectangular they are, how tall the sidewall is. But the forms have stayed pretty true across Indiana. This is sometimes called a Switzer barn, and it has to do with the way it has the same pitch, but one side has a longer roof. And this was frequently done when there's a ramp or bank going into the upstairs part of the barn. You can't see the forebay very easily, but it's right there, facing the other direction. And there's usually a wagon door that goes into the animal low. This one has a stone foundation. Sometimes these are referred to as banked barns or bank barns, and sometimes they're referred to as ramped barns. So for me, if you've excavated a hill and built your barn into it, it's a bank barn. If you've excavated a hill and piled the dirt up on one side of the barn in order to ramp upstairs, it's a ramped barn. And they are different. They work slightly differently. But this is a variation. Almost all the Pennsylvania Dutch barns have either a ramp or a bank on one side because access to the second floor was critical. And often they have doors all the way across the ramp. This is one actually in Pennsylvania, in eastern Pennsylvania, southeastern Pennsylvania, which is the so-called origin of this barn. And this one is actually an enclosed forebay. It wasn't added on according to the man who owned it. It's the original forebay, but you can see that the roof, it has its own slightly flat roof, and it's a much larger forebay. But basically, the forebay is a way of adding floor space to the upstairs and providing shelter for animals downstairs in inclement weather. And this one is what's called a posted forebay, because it's so big that they had to put columns in there to hold it up. I got so many devices up here, I don't know what to do next. So bank barns, I've already said what I really want to say about them, but sometimes that ramp is the whole end of the barn. Sometimes the bank is usually it's on the long side of the barn, but not always. And there are infinite variations of these. But notice again the English barn configuration. Now this barn is probably built sometime in the 1870s to 1890s. And it has very elaborate louvered ventilators, a lovely stone foundation, decorative arches and window glass over the main door, but it's still a rectangular barn with a gable roof about the same size as the traditional English barns, probably 4 bays. It's probably 30 by 50 feet, something like that. The earliest ones are 30 by 40 or so. So this has lasted now from the settlement period, not including the time it was developed in its home country. This basic style of barn was still being built at the break of the 20th century, okay? With adaptations, and again, a similar thing where you have a ramp taking you upstairs. And this isn't a Pennsylvania barn. It doesn't have a forebay. This is just a ramped barn. But again, threshing aisle on the side. It has a dormer roof on it, which is almost always for ventilation, occasionally for machinery upstairs. Just another variation, lots of ventilation. Here's one that's banked in to a hillside, has a beautiful hand split limestone foundation on it. And this barn, according to the owner, was exclusively built for grain storage. That's what its original use was. Just a variation on the bank style. And then the one thing that when I talk about the scientific revolution in agriculture, the one product that comes out of that is maybe the most meaningful in the Midwest is the Wisconsin livestock barn, or the so-called dairy barn. It's very long. The model that we have back there is an early example of that kind of configuration, and ours is only probably 25% of what the full length of it would have been. So we didn't have enough tables to build the whole barn. But again, lots of ventilation, side aisle as well as transverse aisles. And I'm sure we've all seen these. There are quite a few in northern Indiana. There's a couple of famous ones down around French Lick, and obviously the Biddle barn, which we had a picture of earlier. There are variations of this. Almost always gambreled or helmeted roofs, primarily for dairy and large dairy operation. and rarely timber framed. So by now they're plank framed or balloon framed. And we'll talk about that in a minute. Here's another example with these lovely dormer ventilators. And this is not a transverse form. This was actually side aisle. There is no drive-through in this barn. And this is, I have put this in because this is an elephant barn, circus barn up in Peru. It's enormous. I don't know, 300 feet long or something like that. And the huge ventilators on. This has been largely restored now. And then basement barns, not to be confused with bank barns, are basically just all the configurations we're talking about, but they're raised up on masonry foundations. And not just a 3-foot foundation wall, but a full wall usually, at least 6 feet. Almost always used for animals. It was a good way to fight off the deterioration of manure. And you'll see beautiful examples of fieldstone in particular, laid fieldstone, ceramic tile. So as these new water impervious and acid impervious products come on the market, they start to be adapted into barns. So you start to see, particularly in dairy operations, ceramic tile, easy to clean inside and out. Basically, you're just erecting a self-supporting wall and putting a loft on top of it. Here's another one. This one actually has that Warsaw block that I was talking about. And tobacco barns, we talked a little bit about them, but the red barn there is actually built to store, or not to store, but to dry tobacco in. And they have ventilated sides, and it's done in various ways. They have doors that open, doors that fold back every 6 or 8 feet, and then lots of racks inside to tiers to hang your tobacco as it's curing. And these are built specifically for that use. They're all over Kentucky and Tennessee. You see some in southern Indiana. Not a lot of tobacco was grown north of, say, Bloomington, so you don't really see them in very many other parts of the state. And as we've already pointed out, a lot of the existing barns were just adapted for drying. Here's another built for tobacco. So these are basically the size, a large railroad car, very, very long, open interior. And when they're full of tobacco, there are many, many tiers hanging in there. This is that double English barn I was talking about, and I just put it back in here because it was adapted on the interior for hanging tobacco. And that's what that pole is for that you see here, these racks. But it's a hewn, you can see it's an old hewn English barn with sawn braces, which is typical, and then these poles throughout for hanging tobacco. Here's the other side of it. And of course, decorated barns, which aren't, it's not fair to call them a style, but they are a moment when there are so many barns in America that, when we mounted this slideshow, a couple of slides got left out, but I had some detailed slides about endangerment of barns. And one of the things that we know from looking at census reports is that in 1900 in the census, they identified something like 220,000 farms in Indiana. 94% of the area of the state was in farming, 94%. So, in other words, all of it, except for their crossroads and Indianapolis, and a few cities that hadn't really started to grow yet. What we did was we extrapolated that number, and we thought, okay, 220,000 farms. They all had at least one barn, and I think we agreed that probably most of them had more than one. Well, let's just say a third of them had two. Okay. Now you've got roughly 300,000 barns in 1900 in Indiana, and I should mention that most of the barns extant in Indiana were built in the 20th century, and the most barns ever built in Indiana were built in the 20th century. So when we talk about historic barns, we're not talking about only timber frame mortise and tenon pin hand-hewn barns. We're talking about anything that's 40 years old or older, really, or at least by historic preservation standards, 40 or 50 years, at least pre-World War II. And almost all the barns in Indiana were built between 1900 and World War II, not including today's metal pole barn. And of course, they're everywhere, but there are nowhere near as many of them as there were wooden barns in their heyday. 6% are left, okay? 20,000 at best. So that's what we're facing as an organization. We're down to 6%. So when somebody says, oh, there's lots of barns, it doesn't matter if I knock this down. No, it matters. Every one of them matters, no matter how bad a condition they're in. You know, a little bit later, I'm going to show you our grant recipients' projects, and I'll show you one that anybody except its owner would have torn down. And now it's in good shape again. Anyway, decorated barns happen largely because there are so many barns on so many roadways that people are going, wait a minute, that's a signboard. That's a place I can advertise. And sure enough, here come the commercial interests saying, can I pay you to use the side of your barn? And of course, male pouch tobacco. Didn't everybody chew tobacco? I think they did. Treat yourself to the best. They're kind of an embarrassment now, but people still restore them, including this one. And there were lots of other kinds of signage, clearly. And people still, you know, lots of people put American flags on them and, you know, political signs, and we put Save Our Barns on them. But the so-called decorated barn historically has to do with how they were painted. And I don't know very much about this. I've never really studied it. I had a student that did some thesis work on it. But black, white, red are the most popular colors. The red linseed paint that originated in Sweden and the northern countries of Europe is probably what led to the popularity of red, because that linseed oil-based paint was red. And it became a very popular way to preserve the wood by using that paint, and that probably contributed to the popularity of the color. Now we see maroon and all variations of red. But the door decoration and so on is a topic yet to be researched, as far as I know. I really don't know why these patterns show up the way they do, or where even, but they're repeated, and you see them all over and over again. And so I know they have an origin, I just don't know what it is. And I know it's in the cultural milieu that we're talking about. So I'm just gonna swing some at you to show you how, you know, this one is particularly common. The way they paint the door to look like it's arched. And this slightly peaked header on the window ventilators is also very common. And this one is less common, but I've seen probably a half a dozen examples of it. And it seems so iconic that it has to have some origin, but next time. Maybe I'll figure it out between now and the next time. Again, here's the same one on a much simpler English barn. Okay, so you have to talk about round barns. And this is a fascinating story. And if you really want to know the story, read John Hanoi's book called Around Indiana. There's 2 editions of it. He's done more research on this than anybody. He's written one on Wisconsin barns, on Illinois barns, and he was working on, there's another one on Ohio barns by another author. But round barns have been very thoroughly studied. Again, lots of them are gone. Indiana probably had as many or more than any other state when they were popular. Their heydays from 1900 to 1920. There's a very interesting story. Franklin King from the University of Wisconsin is credited with designing and engineering the first true circular barn, meaning not polygonal but round, and the unsupported. Well, his wasn't an unsupported roof. He had a silo. He was actually a silo specialist, and he devised a round silo when all silos were square, and he built it on the inside of the round barn, and that's what basically supported the roof. But in any case, there's a really fascinating history between this man, Benton Steele, who was a self-trained architect builder, and Horace Duncan, who was also builder / architect. Their competition, they worked together. The famous Littleton Round Barn near McCordsville here that was so badly damaged. We highlighted it in another meeting. It was badly damaged by tornado. And Frank Littleton, who was the owner and who financed that barn, was a well-known lawyer in Indiana. He was a congressman. I think he was the Speaker of the House for several years. He was very influential in spreading the word about round barns. And the earliest round barns, I should say, were almost all built by well-to-do farmers who wanted to represent a progressive view of agriculture. And this is also part of the scientific revolution. And there was a strong belief that round barns were better because the farmer didn't have to walk as far when he worked. He could go in a circle instead of back and forth in an aisle. If you actually count the steps, probably not. But they had a loft above. It was easy to feed the stalls. The stalls were on the outer ring. They were particularly popular in dairy operations. They had their problems and they had their detractors, but they were very popular during this period of time. And it's mainly because of Franklin King, who was working through a university and very influential with the ag publications of the day. And I don't know, this was news to me. I didn't grow up on a farm, and I've never studied agricultural history per se. But in doing research on barns, I discovered how many agricultural publications there have been since post-Civil War on, and these men who built these round barns and promulgated them and tried to make them popular for their own well-being, of course, used these agricultural magazines to advertise these styles. And they literally popularized them through catalogs and monthly newsletters and local papers and so on on the small communities all through rural Indiana. And also spread out, when they popularized them, they went out, and Horace Duncan and Benton Steele built the University of Illinois round barns. They had a great partnership for many years. And then, but Frank Littleton, the lawyer congressman, decided to help Horace Duncan patent the true round barn, the true circular barn, it's sometimes called. And Horace Duncan had invented a rafter connection for the round barn because round barns tended to spread the walls. And so you needed the wall to support the rafter system in an open interior circle. And he invented a connection, it's very simple actually, that he wanted to patent. And Frank Littleton, who was a very influential lawyer, went through the US Patent Office and got a patent for him on this particular thing. Now Horace Duncan is claiming to have invented the true circular barn when everybody knew that Franklin King was the one who did it, And Benton Steele is mad because he's out in the field building barns, and suddenly Horace Duncan is going around saying, wait a minute, I've got a patent on that. If that person's going to build that barn, I get $25. And he started suing people who built round barns for $25. And he said, now, if you had come to me, it would only have cost you $12 to buy your patent permit. But now you're in a penalty. Well, obviously, Benton Steele and Horace Duncan stopped being friends really quickly. I mean, it's a great story, and John Hanoi really articulates it well. I can't remember all the details, but it really is an interesting one. The upshot was that Benton Steele moved west and left Indiana. And he was like, I've had enough of this. All my clients are being sued by this guy after their barns were built by me, not by him. And then some of them didn't even use the patented details. But Horace Duncan's running around suing everybody. And some sources say that was the end of the round barn because it just became so contentious that people didn't feel free to build them because this guy's got a patent on them, right? Well, be that as it may, the round barn fell into disuse and lost its popularity. And probably the truth is it never really did do all of the things it was claiming to do. And one of the claims was that it was a spiritually better place. okay? And this goes back to Fowler and the Octagon House and phrenology and all kinds of other sort of mystic stuff. So the round barn is always kind of associated in this sort of mystical view of, like, you know, agricultural health as well as animal husbandry health and so on. They're better for you. That's the easiest way to say it. They're beautiful, they're unique, and we're really lucky to have the 60 or so that are left. Here's some pictures of some of our better ones. This one is particularly remarkable. 4 stories, double ramped. You've probably seen this one. Some of them are basement barns, some of them are in banks, lots of them are ramped. But it's a fascinating story, and I'll never be able to do what John has done with his round barn books, but they're worth the read. I want to just talk briefly about the primary transition to 20th century buildings, because they do become so common and so popular, and they're basically what we have now. We have built a model of a barn called the Shaver truss style, and Mr. Shaver, who we've highlighted on our posters back there, engineers this particular truss to create an open hayloft. And it isn't the best one devised. I don't think he patented it, but many people copied it. And the barn we were talking about earlier is an example of it. And we decided we wanted to build one because it is kind of an early example of the transition from timber framing to what becomes known as plank framing. And the phenomena here, think post-industrial revolution or late industrial revolution. So we've got timber framers who are itinerants, who are traveling the countryside, working for farmers, who are cutting their own trees, and they're coming onto the site, and they're designing the barn with the farmer. They're laying down the trees. They're hand hewing all the timbers. They're building all the mortises and tendons and so on. And this itinerant world is really a world that comes out of the medieval period and is pre-industrial revolution. And when the industrial revolution hits and everything starts to be commercialized and we're producing all kinds of product, and farms become larger and larger and more commercial operations, fewer and fewer obviously become our family farms anymore. But there's a demand for large buildings, large hay buildings and farm buildings. And the timber frame barn, as I said before, and I'll give you an example of it, were built up into the loft area, and so the timber frame actually obstructed hay storage. So the hay barn comes into popularity, and people work really hard to devise an open space. And so they change the gambrel roof and so on in order to do this. And they go to trusses, which are frameworks, instead of bents, which are timber frameworks. But the other thing that happens here that influences it that's not understood very well is that we're running out of trees by 1880. So it's hard to believe, but if you've been in the National Forest in southern Indiana, that was completely forested off by 1940. It was just bare, eroded ground, okay? And the National Forest is there because we came in with federal assistance, planted trees in order to save the ground. So that forest is new. You know, I mean, it's not a lot older than I am. Probably not any older than I am. Sam, we forget that we had virtually deforested the country by 1880. Now, what is still being forested, the Upper Peninsula of Michigan and some of the large pine forests, which were overlooked early on. Well, in the East Coast, they were used in the settlement period and sent off to England, and they made masts for ships. And so almost all the white pine was clear cut out of New England, by 1700. But in the Midwest and in our area, the white pine is sort of the last stuff to be cut. And almost all of it is being used, is in response to the demand for housing and the new so-called balloon frame style of building. So you're no longer building bearing wall buildings out of of brick and stuff. You're building frame buildings, 2x4s spaced 16 or 20 inches apart. The balloon frame is a specific kind of framing where the stud goes all the way to the rafter, and then there's a top plate. And now we do what's called platform framing, where you build the first floor and put plywood on it and then build a second floor on top of that. But the balloon frame was very adaptable for barns. And so there's not as much timber. What timber there is, unless you have it on your own farm, is very expensive. Where it used to be you could buy a tree for 50 cents, now you're buying a tree for $12 or more. So it's very expensive to build a timber frame barn because now you got hundreds of dollars in material, which before you didn't have. And it's the rarer the trees get, the more expensive they get. And the demand for housing wants all the trees. And so timber framing basically dies. And the connection to the Industrial Revolution is that timber framers die out at the same time. So we're losing all of that tradition kind of because of environmental degradation, really. So this barn is the response, these frame barns. And now we have manufacturing companies that are sending out catalogs with pre-cut barn kits, like Sears and Roebuck and so on. I think I have one of those catalogs back there. And they're designing the truss systems for you. And so depending on this, in this example of a milled lumber barn from Loudon, depending on the width of the barn, they're showing you how long your truss pieces have to be. And they basically completely designed the barn. And you could buy these in kits for very little money, really. Here's an example of a barn like that, very similar to one of the ones we saw earlier. Completely unsupported interior with a braced outer wall. Just a diagrammatic example of the experimentation that's going on to try to get rid of or try to open up the hay track space. So the hay track comes along in 1870 roughly and becomes extremely popular for moving loose hay through your loft. But unless this space is open, it's really difficult to do. And in the old timber frame barn, in this case, they've taken out the cross tie in order to make it work, and they hang the hay track here. In this one, the hay track hangs lower. This is one of the early truss designs. And here's another similar one. So these are just to give you an example of how people are playing with this idea. Here's a timber frame barn that has a hay track in it. Now you're only seeing the end bents, but if you think of these going back all the way through the barn, you can see what the obstructions would be. So this would be an obstruction, and this would be an obstruction, this header, and this tie beam as well. And here's an example of a barn that's been readapted to open up this space. There used to be tie beams in here, and they took them out in order to have the hay track. Now this barn's in terrible condition, but that's an example of some of the things that were done if you had a barn and you needed to adapt it for hay storage. And here's an example of a swing beam barn. This is a swing beam. You don't see these as often. This means it's a large beam that's cut like a truss. It's peaked to give it strength, and it doesn't have to have a central post to hold it up. And the reason it's called a swing beam is you could drive your team in there with a wagon full of hay or whatever, and you could swing the team around under that beam and drive back out the same door. And in this barn, it's built into a bank, and the far threshing door hangs over 10 feet off the ground, so you couldn't drive through. You had to swing around. And this one also has a hay track in it, but it's obstructed by the tie beams. Here's another example of adaptations that happen to the timber frame, and these are called purlin braces, those diagonal pieces that open up that central area. And here's an example of it in a barn that we inspected. This is an all timber frame barn, but the loft space is they use these purlin braces. The purlin is the long piece that travels where the rafters rest on, central to the rafters. And these are all adaptations. So this is a Shawver truss. put out by the Loudon Machinery Company, who's selling all kinds of mostly dairy equipment. So you could build this barn by their kit, and they would sell you all the stanchions and all the milking equipment and all the rotating manure carriers, and the entire thing could be equipped, ready-made, basically. And this is one of the patterns that we took our model barn from. And here's an example of a barn with a Shawver truss. So this is it. Comes up off the floor. This is called the gable truss because it forms a peaked gable. And they're braced, and they worked well, but they still impinge on the interior space somewhat. And so there are other adaptations to open up timber framing. One way is to not frame through the middle with cross ties, but to frame out at the edge under the purlin. I know this is probably more than you want to know, but if you'll notice, these are plank framed pieces. They're not timbers anymore. They're 2x8s nailed together. And then so to get the bracing that cross ties provided, they started bracing the outer wall. And that creates a triangulated brace that holds the barn together while opening up the middle. These are all framing adaptations that people are sometimes doing after the barn's built. Here's a beautiful one where they truncate what used to be a tie beam coming all the way across. But now they're designed to take the purlin brace and hold it up and leave the entire, not the entire, but most of the interior open. The detail of it. I mean, somebody took the time to actually make it beautiful. It's lovely. Another example. And another diagram of bracing the barn roof through the floor in order to open up the middle. They even show the hay hook in the drawing. And here's an example of that particular design. And these braces, these purlin braces, go all the way through the floor to the ground floor. This is the loft. But they're in the way, but they're not in the way of the hay track. They're just in the way of the hay. There's a lovely detail. So this framing now is nailed together, and it's referred to as plank framing as opposed to timber framing. And if you want something the size of a big timber, you buy 2x8s and you nail them all together. You laminate your beam. And that's what we did in that model. We laminated strips of wood to show the structure. And then there's this transition period where you get timber framing and plank framing together. And this is my last example because it's just such a beautiful brick barn. But this is a tensioned cable truss. So this is what eventually happens in big bearing wall brick buildings is you get open space by engineering a cable truss. So these are tensioned cables that are basically holding the walls together and supporting the roof.